Fully loaded Hockey East rosters with the end of World Juniors, a marquee rematch between BC and Providence, and a fully loaded women's Beanpot preview all coming up on This Week in Hockey East. Hey everybody, so glad you're with us. With Eric Galante, I'm Tyler Murray. We're getting really into the home stretch. Full conference play coming up on the men's and women's sides, and an interesting time in college hockey, of course, Eric, with an exciting World Junior tournament. That's going to lead us right into some great marquee matchups across the conference. Take it away, my friend. What do you got for us to get things going?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about World Juniors before we get too far away, just because I thought it was, every year it seems to be taking on more and more eyeballs get on it, but especially with the number of college hockey players that were there, 22 college hockey guys on the U.S. team alone, plus a bunch of other teams. And that relates to Hockey East as well. And I think that's worth noting. And, I think the guys that we might have expected to perform really well were the ones that performed really well. Cutter Gauthier was tied for the tournament lead in points for the U.S. That's no surprise there. The BC freshman that you'd expect to play, Michael Thrabo, was pretty good. We'll talk about him in a little bit with it relates to UMass. Celebrini, obviously, for the Canadians. But I think, in terms of digging out some things that we can really take from the tournament and what we can look for in the second half. Number one, I thought it was interesting that not only did Cutter Gauthier lead the tournament in points, but he did so on just 2 goals, but 10 assists, which usually his numbers are opposite that. Now, you would expect his scoring to continue for BC, but he had a real impact in terms of his setting up other scorers on the U.S. team. I thought that was interesting, number one. Number two, you had 4 guys from Hockey East alone average a point per game in the tournament. Gauthier, Gabe Perreault, Macklin Celebrini for Canada, and then Will Smith as well. And Ryan Leonard was just shy of a point per game for Boston College. So that's 2. And then number 3 is it relates to Boston College, and that'll take us into a big series this weekend that BC has with Providence. One of the spots that the Eagles have struggled might not even be the right word, but at least a number that jumps out is the face-off percentages, especially for Will Smith and especially for Cutter Gauthier. Both of those guys were over 60% on the draw in the tournament. Now, the face-off rules are a little bit different internationally than they are here in college hockey, but I think it's still worth noting, especially Will Smith, who was up at 65% on his face-off. He had been down around 40% for the year for BC. So that might be something to watch as BC goes into Providence, and this weekend it'll be at BC on Friday night, at Providence on Saturday. It's amazing that BC hasn't officially played a game since that last game against Providence on December 9th, which felt like a playoff game. 6 goals in the third period, back and forth, 5-4 Eagles win. And really, I think, an important game for the Eagles with some momentum going into this long break. And we'll see how they do against Providence in a game that Providence is going to have revenge on the mind. Both teams coming out of this long break. Providence did play officially a game against Brown over Christmas break, but other than that, it's only just been the one game since that BC game. So what a way to get started between those two teams, kind of restarting the season here for the stretch run.
All right, let's take a look at a great home-and-home series, UMass and Merrimack in Amherst on Friday, in North Andover on Saturday, 7 o'clock, both games on ESPN+. If you want a close one, odds are you're going to get one between these two teams. The last 8 matchups between the Warriors and the Minutemen have been decided by 1 goal, and half of them have gone to overtime. This trend goes back to December of 2020. They have not played a game that was decided by more than 2 goals since October of 2018. So it's going to be tight. Now, specifically for UMass, they've had 3 straight games go to overtime themselves. A shootout loss to Cornell, loss to Clarkson, and a shootout loss to UConn. So they have dropped a little bit in the pairwise. They're 13 right now, but they don't seem overly concerned, and I don't think they should be. Greg Carvel candidly said after the UConn game, I thought we were the slightly better team. We were missing 3 key guys that were probably a difference. Michael Hrabal, one of them, Donzla Schmillis, another. They were both at World Juniors. And then Samuli Ninasari, one of the best defensive defensemen. He was banged up and unavailable. But yeah, let's talk about Hrabal a little bit. I mean, he gets probably the lion's share of credit for the upset win over the Canadians for Czechia. 28 saves, a phenomenal netminder, and great to see the freshman continue to build his confidence on the national stage. And then Donzla Schmillis, the Bruins' 4th-round pick for Latvia, he led them with 5 points through 5 games. In the 7-2 loss to the U.S., he had both of their goals, and man, he's already excelled on the national stage at maybe even a higher level, but what he brings in terms of effort, physicality, and just skill to UMass, it's tough to replace, so they will both be back. And, for UConn, they, of course, earned that win last weekend. They did have Matthew Wood back from Team Canada, but he did not have a point in the eventual shootout win for the Huskies. Now, for Merrimack, they won 3 games in 5 days last week. A Friday, Sunday, Tuesday schedule. They beat Brown, Stonehill, and Holy Cross, so some non-conference success. Against Holy Cross, it was an overtime winner from Alex Jeffries. And I want to focus on some of their top-end guys like Jeffries. We know Merrimack is the ultimate tough-to-play-against team. They do so many good things as a group collectively, but you just look across the landscape of Hockey East and how much high-end talent there is. I think for Merrimack, they know they've got 2 forwards who can be real difference makers in their own right. Jeffries is the highest-scoring senior in Hockey East by points per game, trying to lead that team back to the Garden. And then Matt Capone, always a part of the conversation. He's a tick ahead of Jeffries in the points per game battle. 17 assists is third in the league for Capone behind teammate Zach Bookman and BC's Gabe Perreault. And Capone, his most recent goal, it was a highlight reel score against Holy Cross. Just his 4th goal of the season. He actually had gone without a goal in 11 consecutive games. It feels like Capone's heating up and going to catch fire in the goal-scoring department. And it's one of those individual effort goals that can really make the difference in these coin flip series that come down to maybe one play. Maybe Capone's the kind of guy who can deliver that again for Merrimack.
Well, because of World Juniors, we've pushed off talking about our Hockey East game of the week, but let's do that right now. It's going to be Friday night as Vermont goes into Northeastern. It'll be Friday at 7 on Nesson and then 7:30 on Saturday. We talked about Vermont a bunch last week in their winning streak. They did lose a rivalry game to Dartmouth 4-3 last week, but still 3 goals on the board. And that's kind of been the biggest thing for Vermont during this stretch. Over their last 7 games now, where they were 5-2 in that stretch, they've averaged 4 goals a game. So they've been really good on the offensive end, and now we'll see if they can carry that through into Hockey East play. One other thing that stands out about their Hockey East performances this year, they've been notable on the road. A shootout win against Providence on the road earlier this year. They had a win in Amherst, scoring 6 goals against UMass on the road this year. In fact, they're 2-1 against UMass on the season. So Vermont has shown kind of an ability to score and to score on the road here recently. And that stands out for the Catamounts as they can try to continue this success that Steve Wheeler has, in an interim role, done a really good job for Vermont. And then for Northeastern, I think one of the things that stood out to me to show, we've talked about them, is the big win there for Northeastern. Their pairwise is still pretty good considering, the slow start in Hockey East. And this is one of the things you talked about Merrimack, talked about UMass, talked about any of these teams. There's so many good teams in Hockey East. There is room to move up in the pairwise. And for Northeastern, I think the big thing that stood out in that game against Quinnipiac last weekend, a 3-3 tie that, Jared Keefe said there are good ties and there are bad ties, and that felt like a good tie. They outshot Quinnipiac 43-37. That had been the big thing for Northeastern. They just were getting outshot too much. They were giving up too many opportunities. And when you don't have Devin Levi back there, that shows up even just slightly more. That can change some wins into some losses. But the fact that their shooting numbers have been a little bit better. They've controlled the puck a little bit better. And 43 shots against Quinnipiac, even in overtime, is not anything to sleep about. So that really stood out to me. And we'll see if that can continue this weekend against Vermont.
Want to focus on a big weekend coming up next for the UNH women. They go to BU on Friday. Then they host Boston College on Saturday. We're going to dive in on those 2 teams in a little bit. But for UNH, they've had to sit on a 5-0 loss to Dartmouth for the last 2 weeks. So, they're fired up for this opportunity, especially because everything is still in front of them in Hockey East. They're tied for 4th right now with 2 games in hand on first place Boston College. And they play the Eagles twice more at the very end of the regular season. So definitely an opportunity for them to keep on moving up. And as always with UNH, the first few minutes of these Wildcats games are going to be huge because when UNH is playing their best hockey, they're getting on the board early, and then they can lock you down with really smart decisions and strong defense. And every team, of course, does better when they score first, but especially UNH. They are now 8-2-1 when they get the first goal, but just 1-8 when falling behind at least 1-0. And they're hoping for their first win eventually when trailing after the first period. When they're getting wins lately, it's just been domination. They're all shutout wins in their last 3. So Sedona Blair leads the conference with 4 clean sheets this season. And as we said, every team wants to score early and often, but head coach Hillary Wood has talked about how much confidence maybe their younger players can get from an early lead, and they can always rely on their veteran players to be able to really know when to set the tone between staying conservative, okay, let's hold the lead, or let's get aggressive and try to add to it. I mean, a great example of a new way to win, I guess, was against Vermont last month. That game was scoreless until the final 3 minutes in the third period. Nicole Kelly broke the tie. There was 2 minutes and 7 seconds left. UNH winds up winning the season series over Vermont. They earned their first win over a nationally ranked team this season. So a lot of good things happening at the Whittemore Center for UNH, but they're really going to find out what they're made of in this interesting weekend against BU and BC.
Yeah, can they be a top 4 team? I think that's the big question, right? It should be a lot of fun to find out. They're right there. They certainly have a chance. Well, it's time to do some short shifts as we transition here. And our short shift segment, as always, is brought to you by the Shift Group, helping elite athletes and veterans turn into elite sales professionals. And because we have the biggest week of the women's season coming up, Tuesday is the first round of the Beanpot tournament, which will take place at Harvard. We're going to focus our short shifts exclusively on the 4 teams participating. Tyler, why don't you get started?
Yeah, let's focus on BU. I guess, first of all, Eric, as excited as we are about that TD Garden championship game, you can't forget BU and BC. That's the first round matchup at Bright Landry Hockey Center, as you said, on Harvard's campus. So, I mean, Beanpot Tuesday, that's going to be must-see hockey as well. Now, BU, they played BC as tough as anybody in a 5-3 loss at Connie Forum back on November 17th. Yeah, 2-goal win for the Eagles, but don't let that score throw you off. It was a 1-0 BU lead in the first. They had a 2-1 lead in the second. Entered the third period tied, and it stayed that way until the final 4 minutes of the game. Gabby Roy scored, and then Abby Newhook had the empty netter. BU's hovering around 500 this year, but they do a lot of things well. Top 3 in Hockey East in faceoffs, second on the penalty kill, trying to match BC's top-ranked power play. Terriers have scored 3 shorthanded goals this year, and they're hoping, of course, for their first Beanpot win since 2019, back when Tara Watchorn was an assistant under Brian DeRocher. She did a lot of winning on the ice at BU and plenty as well as an assistant, but this would be a real culture setter if she can find a way to win the Beanpot in her first year as the bench boss at BU.
And of course, they'll take on a BC team in the first round that is 11-3-2 since losing their first 4 games of the season. So they have really bounced back in a big way. We talked last week a lot about Sammy Tabor. She just continued her great play with a big win at Maine. She now has 22 points in her last 12 games for Boston College. You mentioned the BC power play. That's really been huge because that was such a struggle point last year. They've totally turned that around this season. So now, this tournament feels wide open. I think that's one of the exciting things about it. Northeastern has been such a heavy favorite the last couple of years. It doesn't feel that way this year. So how does everyone go in with that little bit more of that wide open feel? And of course, the fact, as you said, that BC already beat BU earlier this season. Those are a couple of things that stand out about that opening game.
Let me give you a little more on Northeastern. This is reason 900 why I love this tournament. The Huskies, of course, they've won 6 consecutive Hockey East championships. So you figure they're dominating the Beanpot too, but that's not the case. Yes, they've won 2 of the last 3, but that ended about a decade drought that went all the way back to 2013. Now, we've touched on this a bit. Some of us thought Northeastern might take a step back this year. You sure about that? I mean, they've won 5 in a row while allowing a total of just 6 goals in those games. Yeah, they're 3-0 against BU. Their only matchup against BC, they won that, and they're back in the national poll again. Now, of course, maybe the offense isn't as overwhelming for the Huskies as it's been the last few years, but they're getting clutch goal scoring lately. Recent overtime game-winning goals from Katie Knoll and Skylar Irving, and it's worth noting each of the last 6 Beanpot championship games have been decided by 1 goal, including 3 that have gone to overtime. So you need primetime players, and they've got at least a handful for Dave Flint again this year.
And it's worth at least mentioning a little primer on Harvard, who will host. And, Harvard under Laura Bellamy, who took over this year, first-year coach, they're still in a transition process. So 3 wins as of this recording. They'll play a couple of tough games this weekend. But the big thing is just how good the ECAC has been this year. And we've talked a little bit about that. So some positives for Harvard recently have been an upset win over St. Lawrence, going back before the holiday break. They played a really nice game against Sacred Heart, and they already have a win over BU this year, by the way, in the Bright Landry Hockey Center. So I think the biggest question when it comes to Harvard is, where is the ECAC versus Hockey East? Because we've seen the ECAC have a ton of success against Hockey East this year, as we've talked about. Does that carry over to to Harvard as well. As we said, they did have a win over BU. It's also interesting. This is the first time since the 1995 Beanpot that we will have 2 new coaches the same season. So it's been a long time since we've had that much change with Tara Watchorn and Laura Bellamy taking over for this Beanpot tournament. But it's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll talk about the final on our next recording, but we won't see you until after the opening round, which should be a lot of fun at Harvard.
It sure should. Adding another chapter to the history books of the women's Beanpot, and then another great weekend in Hockey East Conference play as well. Can't wait to talk to you next week on This Week in Hockey East.